And so, Ezra, Nehemiah, and the Levites not only explained to the people what they should do, but they explained to the people what they should do on the basis of the respective laws in the Pentateuch. And then thirdly, and more generally and widely, the words which all the people understood, verse 12, refers on the whole to the Pentateuch itself, the 5 books. All of it, not every particular verse, but taking it as a whole. And here I draw your attention to the many references to the Pentateuch in the early verses of Nehemiah 8. Verse 1, Ezra is to bring the book of the law of Moses. Verse 2, he brings it out. Verse 3, he reads it. Verse 5, he's opening this book in front of everyone. And verses 7 and 8, Ezra with the Levites are reading it and explaining it so that the people can understand. This reading and exposition of the law of Moses went on from daybreak to midday, about 6 hours. We would say 6 o'clock in the morning to noon, 6 hours. To this reading, verse 3 says, all the people were attentive, listening very closely. And then verses 7 and 8 says, these people understood the reading, because the preaching enabled them to understand it. Now it all boils down to this. The chief thing that the people were called to go home and do in verse 12 is rejoice. Go home and be glad. We know this is the chief thing of the 4 because it's the climax. Eat, drink, send portions, and rejoice. And the 3 other things, eating, drinking, and sending portions to the poor, are subservient to it. Then we have the reason. The reason for the 4 things, and especially the climax and culmination of it, the reason for your joy is because they had understood the words that were declared unto them. The words which were declared unto them are, well, from Nehemiah, Ezra, and the Levites, this is what you do. This is what you do today, because this is what it says in the Pentateuch about the Feast of Trumpets, which day it is. And this Feast of Trumpets needs to be understood in the light of the whole revelation of God in the Pentateuch, because you've been brought out of Egypt, and God spoke these laws in Mount Sinai, and now it's the 1st of the 7th, and you go home and rejoice. Now, after that necessary and somewhat close examination of the structure and drift and argument of our text, we're ready to get down to more applicatory things. We're ready to answer the question that is the first point of the sermon: great rejoicing in what? Why did these people go home from a worship service, to use 21st century terminology? Why were they to go home and rejoice? The people here were not to go home and rejoice because they lived in nice dwellings. Now, their houses may have been nice. They have returned from the captivity and they've been building them again. Haggai speaks of that. And they were indeed to be thankful for them. But when you go home today, you're not to rejoice principally in the fact that, boy, you've got a nice house. Do give thanks to God for that, but that's not the heart of it. That's not the chief thing for which you should be glad. The people also were not to go home and rejoice greatly and smile and be cheerful because they had food and drink. Now, they did have food and drink. Haggai tells us there were times when they didn't because God blighted their crops. But here they, or at least most of the people, had food and drink. And according to verse 9, the food and drink they were consuming was of top quality. We read the verse 10, rather, of eating the fat, good quality meat, a good cut, and drinking the sweet wine, or, as some of the commentators suggest, wine maybe even mixed with a little honey. So they've got the best of fare then available to them. And for us this means that when we go home from church today, we're not principally to rejoice in a good Sunday dinner, although there's nothing wrong with a good Sunday dinner, and be thankful to God for it. Verse 12 indicates too that the people were not to rejoice principally in that they had the joy of sharing. Verse 12 does speak of that. Go your way then, eat and drink, and send portions to the people who lack, the widows and the orphans, and the poor and the strangers in Judah. And there is no doubt too that it is a joyful thing to have a fellow saint over at your house, to fellowship with them, to spend your afternoon with them, eating and drinking. Be thankful for that. Engage in that. But that's not the key idea or ground for rejoicing here. To put it positively, all the people went home to rejoice because of the preaching, the content of the Word of God which they had heard. And here too we need to be clear. They go home rejoicing in the preaching, not so much, or really, the preacher himself. The people weren't to go home saying, I'm really happy, I'm very cheerful because Ezra was there today, and Ezra was wearing a really nice new robe, and he just looked so well up there. He really looked the part. Or maybe, to speak to issues of our day, I'm really happy today after the worship service because Ezra was dressed casually. He was wearing a polo shirt, and instead of preaching behind a lectern, he brought in a bar stool. And he sat on the bar stool, and it was really intimate and close. I've heard people like that. They came home from church, and that was the number one thing. I don't know what he preached about, but he was so casual. And there was a bar stool, and it was just, well, what did he say? What was he dealing with? But he just looked so good up there. That's not it. The people went home and rejoiced, not because of the audience or assembly. And there was a big crowd there. Verse 1 says, all the people gathered themselves together as one man into the street, a broad place, a plaza, because you needed somewhere grand to fit them all in. And so the people were not to go home saying, wasn't that wonderful today that we get a really big crowd? That's not it. That's not it. And wasn't it wonderful too that we had a good crowd and there was good weather? Because in Ezra and Nehemiah we read of times when there were storms and rain. And typically at this time of the year, late September, to match our calendar with the Hebrew calendar, the weather is very pleasant. The people were to go home too and rejoice, not because of the setting or architecture. They weren't to be particularly glad walking off home and sitting at the table because, well, this Sunday it was a bit different. We're usually in a sort of a room, but it was open air today, and that made it more interesting. Or because we had a new platform or pulpit. Nehemiah 8 verse 4 talks about that. Ezra the scribe stood upon a pulpit of wood, which they had made for the purpose. So it was a new one. And it was made of wood, probably some very fine wood, and maybe it was nicely stylized, and perhaps it was big. Because verse 4 talks about 13 other men, 6 on one side and 7 on the other side, along with Ezra. And if they were on the platform or pulpit,